White woman's bag blocks. Black CEOs. Seat, minutes. Later, the flight is canceled. In shocking twist, her tote bag was already sitting in his seat before he reached row 2. Marcus Webb had flown 211 times in the last 6 years, and not once had a stranger simply claimed his seat and refused to move it. Until 6:47 a.m. on a Monday, until a woman named Deborah Colton decided a black man in a plain navy coat did not belong in 2B. 14 minutes later, the airline's regional vice president would be standing at the aircraft door, reading his name off a contract worth $410 million. 9 minutes after that, the entire flight would be pulled from the schedule and canceled outright, every passenger rebooked. Every camera on the tarmac turned toward a single gate. Nobody sitting in that cabin knew any of it yet. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Marcus Webb's morning had started the way it always did, the same way it had started for 19 years, long before anyone at Crestline Airways knew his name. He woke at 4:50 a.m. in a hotel room 2 floors below the executive suite his assistant kept trying to book him into. He made 1 cup of coffee, black, in the paper cup the hotel provided, because he had learned a long time ago that carrying his own thermos through security only slowed him down, and he had never once needed the ritual of a nicer mug to feel like himself. He ate a banana standing at the window, looking out at a runway he could not yet see, just the orange glow of ground lights against a dark sky. He packed his own bag. He always packed his own bag, even now. It took him 9 minutes, the same 9 minutes it had taken since he was 22 years old and flying on a coach ticket to a job interview he could barely afford the flight for. There was a kind of comfort in a routine nobody else needed to witness. At the hotel that morning, the front desk clerk had offered to call him a car service the hotel used for its higher-tier guests. He thanked her and walked the 4 blocks to the airport shuttle stop instead, his canvas backpack over one shoulder, a single duffel bag in his hand, with a broken zipper pull he had never gotten around to replacing. When the shuttle driver reached for his bag, Marcus lifted it into the luggage rack himself before the man's hand got there. He did not need anyone to know who he was. He had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in a room is almost never the most important one. His phone had buzzed 6 times before he reached security. 2 calls from Denise Okafor, his chief operating officer, 1 from Michael Tran, his general counsel, 1 text from Walter Simmons, the chairman of Ashcombe Dynamics Board, who only called before 7 in the morning when something was either extraordinary or catastrophic. He silenced the phone and slid it into his coat pocket without reading past the first line of the text. Whatever it was could wait until he landed. It usually could, until the day it couldn't. He wore the same navy overcoat he had worn through 3 winters, a small tear along the inside seam that his tailor had offered to fix for free more than once. His duffel bag was 8 years old, the strap replaced twice with a plain nylon substitute, rather than the branded original, because he had never seen the point of an object announcing something a person should demonstrate through their work instead. Nothing about him signaled the number that sat quietly on a term sheet 3 floors above Ashcombe Dynamics headquarters in Atlanta. 47 years old, founder and majority owner, and for the last 9 years, chief executive officer of a company that Crestline Airways was, at that exact moment, 40 hours from signing a $410 million contract with. At security, a TSA officer glanced at his boarding pass, then at him, then back at the pass, the way officers do when a first-class ticket does not match the coat and shoes standing in front of them. He said nothing about it. Marcus said nothing either. It happened often enough that he had stopped noticing the exact moment it happened. Only the aftertaste it left, faint and familiar, like the smell of jet fuel that lingers on a coat long after the flight has ended. Somewhere over the last 9 years, 4 separate business magazines had requested a cover interview with him. He had declined 3 of the 4, and the one profile that ran used a photograph so poorly lit that most people who met him afterward did not recognize him from it. His communications director had asked, more than once, whether he wanted a better photo taken. He always said the same thing: the work speaks. I don't need to. It would turn out, before this particular Monday was finished, to be the single most useful decision of his career. Gate B-22 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport smelled the way every gate in the world smells: recycled air, machine coffee, the particular sourness of industrial carpet cleaner that never fully leaves. The departure board above the counter read Crestline 482 Atlanta to Seattle. Boarding 6:50 a.m., and beneath it, 52 passengers sat in the kind of half-attention that comes an hour before dawn has finished arriving. Deborah Colton walked through the gate area the way frequent flyers, with a certain kind of status, walk through gate areas, unhurried, chin slightly raised, a designer tote slung over one shoulder, and a rolling case behind her, with a luggage tag that read Sapphire Elite in small silver letters. She had flown this route for 11 years, twice a month, ever since her daughter moved to Seattle for graduate school. Gate agents at this counter knew her by first name. She had a habit of arriving early enough to be first in line for priority boarding, and she almost always was. 10 minutes earlier, a young mother traveling alone with a crying infant had been struggling to fold a stroller at the jet bridge door, and flight attendant Nancy Pruitt had stepped out from behind the counter without being asked, folded the stroller herself, and carried it down to gate check, murmuring something soft and reassuring to the baby the entire time. It was the kind of small competence that made passengers trust her, the kind that had earned her a customer commendation letter twice in 12 years. It was also the kind of moment that made what came next so much harder to explain. The gate closed for boarding in 19 minutes. Deborah had boarded during Priority Group 1, walked down the aisle, and set her tote bag squarely in the center of Seat 2B, the empty seat beside her own confirmed Seat 2A. She did this the way she did most things, as a small, wordless claim on more space than she had paid for, assuming, as she often did, that the seat would remain empty, or that whoever arrived to occupy it would simply take one look at her settled presence and choose to sit somewhere else. Marcus checked his watch, a habit rather than a need, and walked down the jet bridge toward Seat 2B, where a woman in a cream cardigan sat with her tote bag, resting exactly where his boarding pass told him he belonged. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "I believe that's my seat." Deborah looked up from her phone, her eyes moving over him once, from his shoes to his face, before she answered. "Oh," she said, and gave a small, tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm actually saving that for my assistant. She's checking a bag. She'll be along in a minute." "That may be," Marcus said, "but this is Seat 2B on my boarding pass. I paid for it." He held the pass toward her, not pushing it into her hands, simply offering it to be seen. Deborah did not reach for it. She glanced at it the way a person glances at a flyer someone hands them on the street, present but unread. "There must be some confusion," she said. "I always fly this seat pair. My assistant sits here every trip." That was the moment the assumption hardened into a decision. Deborah had made it in the first 3 seconds. The moment she saw him, a man in a worn coat with a duffel bag, no visible status signals, standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin she considered, in some unspoken way, an extension of her own living room. She had not examined that assumption. She had simply acted on it, the same way she had acted on similar assumptions 100 times before on this exact route. Most of them never tested, most of them never noticed by anyone at all. A man in 1C lowered his newspaper an inch and did not lower it further. A young man in a gray hoodie in row 3, headphones around his neck, watched the exchange without moving, his hand hovering near his phone, and never quite lifting it. An older man, across the aisle in 2C, a retired postal worker named Harold Given, set down his crossword puzzle entirely and watched with open, uncomfortable attention. 3 passengers, 3 separate kinds of silence. Marcus did not raise his voice. "I understand you'd like the seat for your assistant," he said, "but I paid $8,200 for this ticket, and it's assigned to me. I'd ask that you move your bag." Deborah's smile thinned further. "There's really no need to make a scene over this," she said. Her voice carried the particular certainty of someone who had never once been asked to move for a stranger and did not intend to start today. "I'm sure the flight attendant can find you something else." A flight attendant nearby, hearing the rise in tone, if not the words themselves, turned her head. Nancy Pruitt stepped closer, her posture professional, her expression already leaning toward whichever side seemed likely to end the disruption fastest. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone bright in the specific way flight attendants make their voices bright when they suspect there is, in fact, a problem. Deborah answered before Marcus could speak. "Yes, there is," she said. "This gentleman is insisting I move my bag from a seat I always use for my assistant. He's being quite forceful about it." Marcus's eyes moved to Nancy. "My boarding pass says 2B, he said, holding it out again. Hers says 2A. I asked her to move her bag so I could sit in my seat." Nancy glanced at the pass, then at Deborah. then back at the pass. The way people glance at facts they would prefer did not require them to take a side. "Ma'am," she said carefully to Deborah, "if this gentleman is confirmed in 2B, I'll need you to move your bag." For a moment something like relief crossed Marcus's face, quiet and brief. Then Deborah leaned back in her seat, folding her arms, and the relief disappeared. "I'm not moving it," she said. "My assistant is going to need that seat, and I am not going to be bullied into giving up a seat pair I have used for 11 years because someone walked up and decided today was the day to make an issue of it." Nancy's professional smile flickered, uncertain. Behind Marcus, boarding had begun to slow. A suitcase wheel squeaked against the carpet. Someone exhaled too loudly. Pause. He looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with pleading, simply looking, and said one sentence that meant nothing to her in that instant, and would mean everything in 19 minutes. "You may want to check with someone above you before this flight leaves the gate." Then he stepped back, set his duffel bag against the bulkhead, and stood quietly in the aisle, waiting. Nancy called the senior flight attendant, a man named Russell Kane who had worked this route for 14 years and prided himself on resolving disputes before they reached the captain's attention. Russell arrived with the brisk efficiency of a man who had already decided, before hearing a single detail, that the calmer looking of the two people in front of him was probably the problem, simply because he was still standing. "Sir," Russell said to Marcus, "the first understand there's some confusion about seating. If you'll just take a seat in the back, I can sort this out and get everyone settled quickly." Marcus did not move. "There's no confusion," he said. "My boarding pass is for 2B. Her boarding pass is for 2A. I'm asking that her bag be moved from my assigned seat. That's the entire issue." Russell glanced at Deborah, whose eyes had gone glassy with the particular hurt of someone who believes herself to be the injured party. "She's traveled this route for 11 years, sir," Russell said, as though seniority in a loyalty program were itself a form of legal title. "I'd really appreciate your cooperation so we can get this flight out on time." The young man in row 3 lowered his headphones fully now, listening without pretending otherwise. Harold Given set his pen down. "My cooperation," Marcus said, his voice still even, "would look like her bag being moved to the overhead bin, which is where it belongs." "Sir," Russell said. And there it was, the phrase every gate agent, every flight attendant, every purser in this exact situation eventually reaches for. The one that means the conversation is over whether the facts have been settled or not. "I'm going to have to ask you to take a different seat, or I can have ground staff assist you off the aircraft." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "I have a valid boarding pass for this exact seat," he said. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't touched anyone or anyone's belongings. I'm not the one refusing to comply with the seating chart." Deborah let out a short, offended breath. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for the first 4 rows to hear. "Some people always have to make a scene." Harold Given, the retired postal worker in 2C, opened his mouth as though he might say something, then closed it again, the way people do when they are not certain intervening is their place. It was not cowardice, exactly. It was the same uncertainty every witness in every airport in the world feels in the second, before they decide whether a stranger's dignity is worth the discomfort of speaking up. Russell exhaled through his nose. "Ma'am," he said to Deborah, "if you could just move your bag while we sort out an alternate arrangement for the gentleman, that would help move things along." It was, in its own small way, an admission, offered so gently that it sounded almost like an apology for having to say it, that Marcus was right and Deborah was not, and that the plan was to ask the person who was right to be the one who moved anyway. Marcus looked at the empty seat, still occupied by nothing but a designer tote bag. "I'll take my seat when it's clear," he said. "I'm not moving to accommodate someone who's sitting in the wrong place." The sound of the boarding scanner behind them gave its short, conclusive beep as another passenger stepped through, a sound that, on any other morning, meant nothing at all. While Russell was still weighing his next move, satisfied he had bought himself 30 more seconds, the departure board mounted near the gate counter refreshed itself for the first time in 6 hours, a routine overnight sync that would, in 11 minutes, surface a note on the manifest that Russell had not yet thought to check. He did not look at it. He had no reason to. In the terminal outside the jet bridge, unseen by anyone in row 2, Marcus's phone buzzed once more against his hip, and this time he glanced down at it, silenced it again without reading it, and slid it back into his coat. 9 missed calls now sat beneath the dark glass, and he still had not turned it over. 2 floors above the gate, inside Crestline Airways Regional Operations Center, 11 people sat around a conference table that had been arguing with itself for nearly an hour. On the screen at the far end of the room was a single line item, Crestline Ashcombe Flight Systems and Security Modernization Contract, $410 million, execution deadline noon Pacific. 14 months of negotiation had produced terms that would replace the airline's aging dispatch and scheduling infrastructure, terms that existed only as long as a signature arrived on time. "We need him reachable before noon," said Michael Tran, Ashcombe's general counsel, checking his phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. "Crestline's board has been clear. This window doesn't extend. If we're not signed by noon Pacific, the whole modernization program reopens to a competing bid." "I've called him 3 times," said a junior associate near the door. "So has Denise, so has Walter, so has his assistant. It's going straight to voicemail every time. He's the only signatory Crestline's board will accept on the security terms," Tran said. "The delegation of authority is specific. Walter made that clear in the spring. If we can't reach him by noon, the whole deal reverts to a full board review on Crestline's side. And their alternate vendor, a firm called Halden Systems, has been circling this contract for a year." There was a second problem in the room that nobody had said aloud yet. A board member named Diane Foss, who had voted against the size of this contract from the beginning, cleared her throat from the far end of the table. "If we can't reach him by 10, I'd like to raise the possibility of authorizing Denise to sign in his place under the emergency delegation clause. This wouldn't be the first time this quarter he's been unreachable during a critical window." Walter Simmons, who chaired the board and had personally recruited Marcus's leadership team 9 years earlier, rubbed his eyes and said what everyone in the room was already thinking without wanting to say it. "The one person on the planet Crestline will accept on this signature is somewhere between a hotel and an airplane, and none of us can reach him." He did not look at Diane when he added, "And we are not discussing an emergency delegation 40 minutes into a communication delay. Let's find him first." While the operations center was sending its 5th unanswered message, Marcus was standing quietly in the aisle of seat row 2, arms loosely at his sides, watching a ground crew vehicle through the small oval window near the door, thinking, without particular urgency, that it was taking slightly longer to clear the wing than it needed to. He had not looked at his phone once since silencing it. The room's newest employee, an assistant named Naomi Reyes, who had been with Ashcombe for 3 weeks, cleared her throat from the back corner where she had been quietly taking notes no one had asked her to take. "I think he might actually be on a plane right now," she said. "His calendar has him on Crestline Flight 482 this morning, Atlanta to Seattle. If he's not answering, maybe he's already boarded and has his phone off." The room did not immediately register the significance. Tran glanced at her, the way senior people glance at junior people who have said something slightly off topic in an urgent meeting. "That's not especially helpful right now, Naomi. She said, "Our own systems monitoring dashboard flags gate disruptions on partner carriers automatically because of the modernization contract testing. There's an active flag on Crestline 482 right now. Seat dispute, gate B22 unresolved." Diane Foss let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're telling me our CEO might be sitting in the middle of the exact kind of incident we're trying to sell this airline software to prevent," she said, as though the idea itself proved something she had suspected all along, though she could not have said what. While Naomi was still explaining herself, quietly, almost apologetically, someone else in the room had already pulled up the flag details on a second screen and stopped scrolling. "Naomi's right," she said. "Gate B22 Seat 2B. Passenger dispute, unresolved for the last 11 minutes. Passenger name on the ticket is listed as M. Webb." The room went quiet in a different way than it had a moment earlier, not confused now, but bracing. Somewhere in the background, a television mounted near the operations center door, muted but running a business news channel on a 5-minute delay, showed a graphic that had nothing to do with any of this. A stock ticker, a small logo crawling past, entirely unaware of what was happening 2 floors below it. A second, smaller problem surfaced almost immediately behind the first. Ashcombe's head of corporate communications, a woman named Els Bergman, who had joined the meeting 15 minutes late and was still catching up, looked up from her own phone with a different kind of concern on her face. "There's already a short clip online," she said. "Not from anyone in the room. Someone in the terminal walking past the gate posted 11 seconds of audio, not realizing what it would turn into. It's on a small account right now, barely any views. But if this becomes a story before we've resolved it internally, we're not managing a seating dispute anymore, we're managing a headline." She said it flatly, the way professionals say the worst-case version of a problem out loud specifically so the room stops pretending it isn't possible. Walter Simmons stood up without a word and reached for his jacket. Tran was already 3 steps ahead of him, phone in hand, calling Crestline's regional office directly, rather than waiting on the general reservations line. Naomi, notebook still in hand, followed without being asked, and nobody stopped her. Denise Okafor, the chief operating officer, dialed the airline's corporate emergency line, the number reserved for exactly this kind of situation, a number most passengers never learn exists. "This is Denise Okafor, with Ashcombe Dynamics," she said when someone finally answered. "I need to speak to whoever is currently overseeing gate operations at Hartsfield-Jackson. This is time-sensitive and it concerns your CEO's flight, not ours." Back at the gate, Russell Kane was midway through a second attempt to persuade Marcus to accept an alternate seat when a Crestline regional operations supervisor named Patrice Odom appeared at the top of the jet bridge, moving with the particular urgency of someone who has just taken a phone call that used words like federal contract and reputational exposure in the same sentence. She had been the duty manager for 11 years and had never once been called down to a gate this fast for a seating dispute. "Russell," she said, cutting in before he could finish his sentence to Marcus. "What's the passenger's name in 2B? Russell blinked. "Webb," he said. "Webb." Patrice looked at Marcus directly for the first time, studying him the way people study someone they have just been told, over the phone, in a voice they had never heard their supervisor use before, is more important than anyone currently standing in this jet bridge. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'm so sorry for the confusion this morning." Deborah's mouth opened slightly, sensing, before she understood why, that the ground beneath her had just shifted. Marcus looked at Patrice with the same measured calm he had held for the last 15 minutes. "I appreciate that," he said, "but I'd like this handled the way it should have been handled from the start. Her bag needs to be moved from my seat." Patrice turned to Deborah without hesitation this time. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a new firmness it had not had a minute earlier, "I need you to move your belongings from seat 2B, immediately." Deborah's face flushed. "I don't understand what's suddenly changed," she said. Patrice did not answer the question directly. "Ma'am, please," she said, and something in her tone made clear the request was no longer a request. Deborah moved her tote bag to the overhead bin herself this time, her hands stiff, her movements sharp, with the particular embarrassment of someone realizing, without yet knowing exactly why, that she had badly misjudged a room. Marcus sat down in seat 2B without another word, his duffel bag tucked beneath the seat in front of him. "Row," said the young man in row 3 under his breath, to no one in particular, using a word he had heard once from a business podcast and never expected to use in an airport. Harold Given picked his crossword back up, though he did not fill in another square for several minutes. Patrice remained standing near the row, her radio crackling faintly against her hip. "Mr. Webb," she said quietly, "I've been asked to inform you that our regional vice president would like a moment of your time before departure, if that's convenient." "It's fine," Marcus said. He glanced toward the window again, watching the same ground crew vehicle finally clear the wing, 3 minutes later than it should have. 2 floors above, Denise Okafor's call had already been transferred twice, first to a gate operations line, then directly to Crestline's regional vice president of customer experience, a woman named Allison Reyes, no relation to Naomi, who had been with the airline for 22 years and had handled exactly one incident in her career that had ever risen to this level of urgency before this one. "Miss Reyes," Denise said, once connected, "my name is Denise Okafor, Chief Operating Officer of Ashcombe Dynamics. Our CEO, Marcus Webb, is currently seated on your flight 482 at gate B22, and I understand there has been a seating dispute that your crew has not yet resolved appropriately. I want to be clear about why this matters beyond the obvious. Ashcombe is 40 hours from finalizing a $410 million contract with your company, and Mr. Webb is the sole signatory. I'd strongly encourage someone from your office to be physically present at that gate within the next 5 minutes." Allison Reyes did not need the sentence repeated. She had already pulled up the flight manifest on her own screen and found the name. "Understood," she said. "I'm on my way down now." Allison arrived at gate B22 11 minutes later, moving through the jet bridge with the brisk, controlled urgency of someone who has spent 2 decades learning to look calm while internally recalculating an entire morning. She found Patrice Odom standing near row 2, Russell Kane hovering uncertainly by the galley, and Deborah Colton sitting rigid in 2A with her arms crossed. staring fixedly out the window. "Mr. Webb," Allison said, extending a hand he did not immediately take, though not out of unkindness, simply because he had learned to wait and see what an apology actually contained before accepting it. "I'm Allison Reyes, Regional Vice President of Customer Experience for Crestline. I want to personally apologize for what happened here this morning, and I want you to know we take this seriously, not as a formality, but because it's simply not who we intend to be as a company." Marcus studied her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate you coming down. But I'd like to understand something first. Your crew confirmed my boarding pass was valid within the first 2 minutes of this dispute. They confirmed hers was assigned to a different seat entirely. Why did it take 15 minutes and a phone call from my office to correct something that simple?" Allison did not flinch from the question, which was, in its own way, more useful to Marcus than an easy answer would have been. "That's exactly what I intend to find out," she said, "and I don't think the answer is going to be comfortable for anyone standing in this aisle right now, including me." Russell Kane, listening from the galley, felt something cold settle in his chest. He had spent 14 years believing that his job was to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to avoid the kind of complaint that ended up in a supervisor's inbox. He was only now beginning to understand that smoothing things over and doing the right thing were not, in fact, the same skill, and that he had spent the entire morning practicing the wrong one. Deborah Colton turned from the window at last. "I didn't know who he was," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone in particular. Allison's expression did not soften. "Ma'am," she said, "that was never supposed to be the reason it mattered." Those 7 words landed harder than anything else said that morning. Deborah had no answer for them because there wasn't one. The problem had never been that she failed to recognize wealth or power sitting 2 feet away from her. The problem was that she had assumed, instantly and without evidence, that a man in a worn coat with a duffel bag did not belong in the seat his own ticket confirmed. And she would have made that same assumption, whether the man turned out to be CEO or a line cook on his day off, because the assumption had never had anything to do with facts in the first place. Allison excused herself briefly, stepping back into the jet bridge to take a call from Crestline's corporate headquarters that would determine, in the next 4 minutes, what happened to the rest of this particular Monday morning. On the other end of the line was the airline's chief operating officer, a man named Franklin Doyle, who had been briefed in the last 90 seconds on everything from the seating dispute to the $410 million contract to the 11-second audio clip that had, by now, been reposted onto 3 larger accounts and picked up nearly 6,000 views in the time it took Allison to walk down the jet bridge. "Pull the flight," Doyle said. Allison hesitated. "Sir, we can resolve this at the gate," she said. "Mr. Webb is already seated. The passenger is compliant. We can depart within 10 minutes. "That's not the problem I'm solving," Doyle said. "We have a documented incident where a valid first-class ticket holder was nearly removed from his own confirmed seat by 2 crew members who chose to side with the passenger who was in the wrong. On a flight our own systems partner's chief executive happened to be sitting on, while we are 40 hours from signing his company to run our dispatch infrastructure. If this flight departs in the next 10 minutes and nothing else happens, the story tomorrow is that Crestline let it slide because it got inconvenient to fix. I want that flight held. I want a full internal review opened within the hour, and I want Mr. Webb offered whatever accommodation he wants, including simply going home if that's what he'd prefer." Allison returned to the cabin 4 minutes later. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I've just spoken with our chief operating officer. This flight is being pulled from today's schedule. Every passenger will be rebooked on the next available departure, fully accommodated, and Crestline is opening an immediate internal review into what happened at this gate this morning." A low murmur moved through the cabin. The young man in row 3 sat up straighter. Harold Given set his crossword down entirely this time. Deborah Colton's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the coming winter outside. Marcus absorbed the news without visible reaction, the same steadiness he had carried through the entire encounter. "You're canceling the whole flight over this," he said. "Not quite a question. We're canceling the flight because our crew made the wrong call under pressure, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise by pushing everyone to Seattle and hoping the story fades," Allison said. "If we depart in the next 10 minutes, it looks like we're trying to make this go away. If we hold and investigate properly, it looks like what it actually is, an airline that got something badly wrong this morning and is willing to say so before anyone forces us to." 52 passengers filed off the aircraft over the next 20 minutes, most of them uncertain exactly why. A few of them, the ones seated close enough to have watched the entire exchange, exchanging glances that said more than any announcement could. Harold Given paused beside Marcus's row on his way out. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "You said something eventually," he said. "That still counts for something." Harold nodded, unconvinced but grateful for the kindness of the answer, and continued down the aisle. The young man in row 3, the one whose hand had hovered over his phone the entire time without ever lifting it, stopped as well. "I almost recorded it," he admitted, like he owed Marcus an explanation. "I didn't know if that would help or make it worse." Marcus considered him. "It probably would have helped," he said, "but not recording it doesn't make you part of the problem. Not saying anything at all would have." The young man nodded slowly and moved on, turning the distinction over in his mind the way people do when they've just been handed a piece of wisdom they didn't expect from a stranger. Deborah Colton was the last passenger asked to step off, escorted not by Russell or Nancy, but by Allison Reyes herself, who walked beside her without speaking until they reached the gate counter. "Ma'am," Allison said there, "I'll need a statement from you as part of our review." Deborah's composure, so absolute an hour earlier, had entirely dissolved. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, her voice smaller than it had been all morning. "That depends on what the review finds," Allison said, "but I'd encourage you to think carefully about why you assumed what you assumed this morning, because that answer is going to matter more to you, long after today, than anything Crestline decides to do about it." The consequence for Russell Kane arrived 2 days later, delivered by Crestline's regional director of in-flight services after a review that included statements from 4 passengers and Nancy Pruitt's own account of being overruled by a purser who had chosen certainty over verification. Russell was suspended for 30 days without pay and required to complete a retraining program before returning to any first-class cabin assignment. He did not appeal the decision. He had spent 2 nights turning the morning over in his mind and had arrived, on his own, at roughly the same conclusion Allison had reached in the jet bridge. Nancy Pruitt received a shorter, gentler conversation with her supervisor, one that acknowledged she had tried to correct the seating error the moment it was flagged, but had ultimately deferred to Russell's authority rather than insisting on the fix herself. It was not a punishment so much as a lesson delivered kindly, the kind meant to be remembered rather than resented, and Nancy carried it with her onto every flight she worked for the rest of that year. Deborah Colton's statement to Crestline's review board became part of an internal file that Marcus never asked to see. He learned only, secondhand and much later, that her frequent flyer status with the airline had been quietly downgraded, not as a punishment exactly, but as a simple, practical acknowledgement that 11 years of loyalty had never been the same thing as 11 years of good conduct. The contract between Ashcombe Dynamics and Crestline Airways was signed 3 days later than originally planned, not because Marcus withheld his signature out of anger, he never once suggested doing so, but because Crestline's board insisted on completing its internal review first, wanting the new partnership to begin on a foundation that had already been tested and repaired rather than one built on top of an unresolved wound. The final terms were unchanged. The $410 million closed exactly as negotiated. Naomi Reyes, the assistant who had noticed the gate flag on the monitoring dashboard, received a short note from Marcus's office the following week, unsigned by name but clearly from him, thanking her for paying attention to a detail everyone else in the room had been ready to dismiss. It was not a promotion, it was not a bonus, it was simply an acknowledgement that someone had tried to connect a fact to its consequence when it would have been easier to stay quiet, and that the attempt had been noticed. She kept the printed note in her desk drawer for the rest of the year. Diane Foss did not raise the subject of emergency delegation again for the remainder of her term on Ashcombe's board. At the next quarterly meeting, when the topic of executive travel protocols came up, she listened more than she spoke. 3 weeks later, Marcus boarded a Crestline flight again, this time on a different route entirely, and found Harold Given, the retired postal worker from row 2, seated 2 rows behind him on the same aircraft by pure coincidence. Harold caught his eye as he passed and gave a small nod, the kind given to someone you recognize without needing to explain why. Marcus returned it, and neither of them said a word, because the nod had been enough for both of them. 6 weeks after the incident, Crestline Airways quietly updated its internal seating dispute policy, to require any first-class seating conflict to be verified against the manifest by a supervisor within 90 seconds, rather than left to the judgment of whichever crew member happened to be standing closest. The policy would eventually be referred to inside the company, informally and without any official name attached to it, simply as the 90-second rule. Nobody outside a small group of executives ever connected it publicly to what had happened at Gate B22 that Monday morning. Marcus never asked for his name to be attached to it. He had never needed anyone to know who he was. The work always made that clear eventually. That evening, on the flight he finally took home, he sat by the window in the seat that was actually his, watched the lights of the city fall away beneath the wing, and thought, not for the first time, that he had lost count of the number of times a stranger's assumption had tried to decide, before a single word was exchanged, who was allowed to sit where. It usually sorted itself out. It always had, so far. If this story reached you, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And subscribe, because the next story is already waiting above the clouds.